Charles Minor in The Office wasn't overly keen on Jim Halpert. Idris Elba's character in The Office didn't stick around for too long, but in the few episodes he appeared in, Charles Minor caused quite the stir at Dunder Mifflin Scranton. Throughout all 9 seasons of The Office, Jim wasn't to everyone's tastes, but he proved himself to be a reliable and trustworthy employee. However, Charles Minor didn't see Jim this way, and his dislike of the paper salesman was apparent from the get-go. Charles Minor thought Jim was lazy and a disappointment. His opinions were fair, but still incorrect. Charles and Jim talking in the conference room in the office. Charles frequently voiced his issues with Jim. Charles took over Ryan's job in Season 5, and Jim's first meeting with the new vice president of the Northeast region didn't paint him in the best light. Jim wore an extravagant tuxedo as part of organizing Michael's anniversary party, but all Charles could see was his unprofessionalism. Granted, Charles' first impression of his employee was perfectly valid, but one of the many harsh realities about Jim in the office was that he did appear lazy. However, viewers knew that this wasn't really the case. On the surface, Jim didn't seem to care about his job. His constant pranks and time-wasting weren't professional, but ultimately, Jim was one of the hardest workers, even if it wasn't a huge effort on his part. What was particularly frustrating, though, was that Charles formed a grudge against Jim before he truly had a chance to show who he actually was. Charles Minor's hate for Jim Halpert may have a different explanation. Perhaps Jim was more of a threat than Charles let on. Dwight looking at Charles in the office. Regardless of his opinions, Charles' attitude towards Jim in general still seemed a little over the top. However, maybe there was a reason for this. Charles loved to suck up to David Wallace, someone who held Jim in high regard. It was clear from Charles' interactions with Michael that David gave the new VP a rundown on the branch and the other characters in the office he'd meet there. Jim was a well-liked employee across the company, and as he'd previously shown interest in working at corporate, perhaps Charles saw him as competition and so focused on his flaws instead. Was Jim really that bad of an employee in the office? Jim had his flaws, but he was far from terrible. Jim Halpert looking defeated during a conference room meeting in the office. Jim wasn't perfect. Yes, he was unfamiliar with what a rundown was, but his sales record and reputation in the office spoke for themselves. If anything, Jim's experiences with Charles motivated him further, as in Season 6, he pitched the idea that he become a co-manager alongside Michael. Ultimately, though, Jim tried, and that was what mattered. He didn't need to prove himself to Charles, not really, as the rest of the company had his back. But Jim still attempted to get into Charles' good books by playing soccer and taking every opportunity to have a positive conversation with him. Jim was never going to become the office's Michael Scott replacement, but that didn't matter. Every senior member of staff had their strengths and weaknesses, but Jim was a generally solid enough employee that he was a great candidate for a corporate job. He didn't take his job too seriously, but he was invested enough to have good sales numbers. Jim and Pam's relationship in the office also played a big part in his character development, too. I've always been baffled by Charles' opinions on Jim in the office, but upon closer analysis, it did make sense.